Good afternoon. We are so pleased that you're joining us this afternoon for this Sundays at Home program. I'm going to apologize up front. I have a bit of a crackly voice today, but I think I'm going to be able to make it today. Today's program is a special edition of our regular Sundays at Home programming, and that it was designed specifically with primary educators and homeschoolers in mind, although everyone is always welcome at National Women's History Museum programs. My name is Lori Ann Turgison, and I serve as the Director of Education at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, we welcome you. For those of you who have attended a Sundays at Home program before, welcome back. And thank you for your continued support. We thank you for taking your time out of your Sunday to be with us this afternoon. As we excitedly await the start of the Winter Olympics next month, NWHM Predoctoral Fellow in Women's History, Mariana Brandman, will guide us through a virtual tour of the museum's Women in the Olympics resources page. True to its name, this is a landing page dedicated to the history of women's participation in the Olympic Games. If you're not familiar with these resources pages, there are numerous examples of them on the museum's website at womenshistory.org. Click on the Students and Educators tab at the top of the menu and scroll down to Topics. A full listing of the various resource pages will populate with topics such as the Civil War and Reconstruction, reform movements, and voting rights. Although there are all there to assist you with classroom-ready digital resources on a variety of teaching themes. This is also a great page to earmark for students who are looking for a National History Day topic or other research subject. In just a minute while my screen clears here, because I have more information I want to share about Mariana. It seems it's not going to work for me. I will tell you on my own. Mariana is finishing up a 2-year tenure with us as our NWHM Predoctoral Fellow in Women's History. She will be graduating from the University of Chicago in May. Her research interests include 20th century US history, women's and gender history, and race, sexuality, and popular culture. Her dissertation, which we have picked her mind about because it is such a cool topic, is Take Back the Mic, the rise of feminist comic performance in American culture. And it traces the work of feminist stand-up comics from the beginnings of the women's liberation movement into the 21st century. Mariana received her BA in history from Yale University and her MA from the University of Chicago, where she has served as a preceptor and teacher assistant for numerous history courses. She's a dedicated public historian and has worked as a researcher and archivist at the Chicago History Museum, the Newberry Library, the University of Chicago Special Collections Research Center, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Library of Congress. And as you can assume from that listing, she is joining us from Chicago today. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. And that is that Mariana will be taking questions at the end of her presentation. If you have any comments during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature that you see there at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for Mariana, she will be happy to answer those at the end of her presentation. And you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature there at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to welcome Mariana to the screen.
Hi, Lorianne. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So welcome everybody to this virtual tour of the National Women's History Museum's Women in the Olympics resource page, especially for K-12 educators in advance of the 2022 Olympics. Today, I'm going to go through the Women in the Olympics resource page, highlighting the museum's materials, providing a little bit of a history lesson on topics related to women in the Olympics, and noting other related resources, both from the museum and outside organizations. But I won't be able to get to everything. You know, with so many games over so many years, there's more records than you can imagine. So this will be a high-level overview in terms of that history, but the walkthrough will give you an idea of the content that we have and the topics in which you can engage your students. We'll also include a list of resources in the chat that I mention or draw on throughout the presentation. And further, I want to note that many of the materials we'll see here were created for the 2016 Summer Games in Rio. So they don't always include the most recent developments or milestones, but I'm going to add some of those in here as we go along too. And so with that, I am going to share my screen. Okay, so here we have the resource page, as you'll see, and I'm just scrolling down to show the whole thing. We'll be looking at the timeline, Women in the Olympics, the digital exhibit up here, Getting into the Games, Women in the Olympics, then the article which really accompanies that exhibit here, Getting into the Games, Women in the Olympics, and lastly, this infographic, Breaking Records. So I'm going to start with the timeline here. Okay, so it starts at the beginning of the modern Olympics. We have Athens in 1896. Here, French academic Baron Pierre de Coubertin is credited with proposing the modern Olympic Games. He believed that such an event would be a force for international camaraderie and peace. So the first games, like I said, Athens, 1896. And at these games, women were not given the opportunity to participate whatsoever. So moving forward, Paris, 1900, this is where women enter the games. Women became athletes for the first time here. Out of 997 athletes, 22 of them were female. 7 American women competed in the 1900 games in the sports of tennis and golf. And the first American woman to win an Olympic competition was golfer Margaret Ives Abbott, pictured here. And I'll give a little more detail on her later. As we go forward, 1904, St. Louis, these were the first Olympic Games held in the United States. They were held in St. Louis, Missouri, and also that year, St. Louis hosted the World's Fair, just as Paris had done double duty 4 years earlier. At this game, Matilda Howell became the first American woman to win a gold medal. In fact, she won 3 for archery, which was the only official sport in which women were allowed to compete in these 1904 games. Now I'm going to skip ahead a little. Okay, we get to 1924, the first Winter Olympic Games. These were held in France, and the Olympic Committee initially sponsored a Winter Games week. Now, this event was so successful that it became its own entity. The Winter Olympics, held the same year as the Summer Olympics, that that continued until the 1990s when they started alternating the years. And at this first Winter Games, women were only permitted to participate in figure skating events. So still a very restricted early beginning. Okay, sadly, we can't stop on every slide. So I want to focus now on Amsterdam in 1928. As time went on, more women's events appeared at the Games. So 1928 was big for track and field, made its appearance. Here we see pictured American Elizabeth Robinson, who was the first woman from any country to win a gold medal in a track and field event. And 1928 also marked a significant increase in female participation in the Games, from under 5% of the total athletes all the way up to 10%. So still small, but progress. Now, the 1928 track and field events are important in the history of women in the Olympics because of issues related to the 800-meter race. So this is a long race, and the women who ran it afterward were understandably fatigued, out of breath, sweaty. Some even fell to the ground after finishing the race because they gave it their all. And these are reactions, frankly, that the male athletes had as well. But media reports of women's reactions after running the 800 meters were greatly exaggerated around the world. And it ended up leading to policies that eliminated the 800 meters race for women all the way until 1960. And it's not just the media that contributed to this, it's also the medical establishment. Male medical experts at the time believed that women couldn't handle the undue physical strain of these distances. And part of that came from the tests they would run, which would feature women running longer distances who had in no way trained, had not built up any endurance. And so they would find that these women were out of breath and fatigued after 200 or 300 yards. And it led to this belief that women simply shouldn't run farther than 200 yards, that it was too strenuous and dangerous for them. And it perpetuated this belief from the Victorian period that vigorous exercise was detrimental to women, and really that it used up energy that was needed for pregnancy, for childbearing, that it could hurt them and hurt their offspring. So this was something that really held back women from competing fully in a variety of athletic events. Okay. Now here we have the 1932 games in Los Angeles. I just want to encourage everyone to watch the video here of Babe Didrikson-Zaharias. She was just a truly extraordinary multi-sport athlete. She medaled in track and field at the 1932 games and was an elite golfer, an amazing baseball player. Her story of all her athletic feats is a really, really phenomenal one. Okay, so the Olympics were suspended in 1940 and 1944 due to World War II, but they returned in 1948. And one of the highlights for women that year was Alice Coachman's gold medal win for the high jump, which is pictured here. It made her the first woman of color from any country to win an Olympic gold medal. Now, at the 1956 games, a few years later, track and field star Wilma Rudolph made Olympic history when she became the youngest member of Team USA at 16 and won a bronze medal. And then 4 years later, at the 1960 Olympics, she earned gold medals in the 100 meter, the 200 meter, and sprint relay events, which made her the first American woman to win three medals in track and field events. A lot of important milestones happening now. We will skip ahead a little bit here. So now we get to gymnastics, 1984. So men's gymnastics events were introduced to the Olympics before women's, but today's it's the women's events that are more popular. Now, the first American gymnast to win a gold medal was Mary Lou Retton in 1984, when she took first place in the all-around category and medaled in several other events. And again, we have another great video for you to look at. So I'm gonna scroll through here a bit. We get some information about team sports for women, soccer, softball, ice hockey, and encouraging their participation. And we'll go over some more of this later, but I just want to jump ahead to London in 2012, evening the odds. So in 2012, for the first time, women athletes outnumbered the men on Team USA. On a world scale, women accounted for about 44% of the total athlete population that year. So at the London 2012 Games, Gabby Douglas became the first African-American woman and first woman of color of any nationality to win gold in the individual all-around competition in gymnastics. And here we see pictured Simone Biles, a gymnast in the Rio Games in 2016, jumping ahead a little bit in the Tokyo Games. When she was just 24 years old, she became the most accomplished American gymnast in history with 7 medals, including 4 golds. And before we wrap up with the timeline, I want to add in just a few other milestones from the Tokyo Games, branded the 2020 Games. Obviously, they took place in 2021 because of the pandemic. And so at that time, Quinn, who is a midfielder for Canada's women's soccer team, became the first openly trans non-binary athlete to compete and to medal at the Olympics, bringing home gold when Canada beat Sweden for the championship. And also that year, Laurel Hubbard, a weightlifter from New Zealand, became the first out transgender woman to qualify for the Olympics. Apologies. So milestones abound. Now I want to turn to the exhibit that we have, Getting into the Games. And if you can see here, I'm going to start going through the exhibit a good way through to focus really on the Olympic portion of it. The earlier sections have more material about early history of women in athletics in the US. So I encourage you to read through the whole thing. It's really great. So here we start with the beginning of the modern Olympics. Lighting a flame. Coubertin founded the Olympics as a celebration of men's sporting achievement. 241 athletes in 1896 competed from 14 countries, and again, they were all men. Smithsonian Magazine wrote of the event, quote, "There might as well have been a no girls allowed sign painted on the entrance," end quote. Okay, and here we see Margaret Ives Abbott, the golfer again. Though not officially sanctioned, women participated in the second and third games in 1900 and 1904. It was in 1908 in those London games where women were officially considered competitors for the first time. And so as mentioned in 1900, Margaret Ives Abbott took first in women's golf. And so what was really interesting about this is one, she was not actually a gold medalist. That was not the prize given at the time. She actually won a porcelain bowl as her sort of trophy for her victory. And also, she actually never knew that she won an Olympic event because it coincided with the Paris Games. The Paris Games coincided with the World's Fair that year. She was under the impression that the competition was part of the World's Fair and not the Olympics. And so sadly enough, she actually never knew of her Olympic victory. Move forward. Okay. So the third Olympics were held in St. Louis in 1904, again, during a World's Fair. And here the US provided the vast majority of the athletes, but only 6 women, all American, competed. And they competed in archery, the only event they were allowed to. And here is Matilda Howell, who won those 3 gold medals for archery. Now, the London Games in 1908, as I said, were the first to officially sanction female athletes competing. So what would happen is national sports governing bodies and federations are the ones to sanction athletic competitions and select the Olympic national teams. And so the American Olympic Committee refused to send any athletes in 1908. But in that year, European women competed in tennis, archery, and figure skating. And then the 1912 games in Stockholm, again, no US women competed. Now, the restrictive and prejudiced attitudes toward female athletes persisted at the highest levels of the organization. After these 1912 Stockholm games, Coubertin and many of his IOC colleagues, that is the International Olympic Committee, they believed, quote, "An Olympiad with females would be impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and improper," end quote. So this is a spot where I want to draw attention to an important historical theme that I think studying the Olympics brings up. The path for women at the Games was not one of straightforward progress. The IOC added events and took them away. Countries would send female athletes and then refuse to do so. You know, the modern Olympic Games span over a century, and each Olympics really reflects the norms and attitudes towards gender, as well as race, ability, and sexual orientation of its period, as well as the member countries that were taking part and the location of the Games. So it is not a straight line by any means. So here we see Eileen Riggin, an American who won for aquatic events. And so I bring this up because just as women's inclusion varied over time in this stop and start way, it varied by sport. further revealing the fluid nature of the gender norms and attitudes towards women's athletics. So exceptions to kind of the mainstream story include swimming. So one reason was simply that when women were swimming, no one could see them sweat. And so it made the sport look not as strenuous. This is likely what allowed aquatic events for women to be introduced as early as 1912. But women who were competing in these events still had to reconcile with the gender norms that were governing their behavior. So one example is many beaches at the time required women to wear full stockings, but these were not good outfits to train in for competitive swimming. And so what female swimmers were known to do was to swim out from shore, get to the jetties or rocks or something that was a little farther out there, take off their stockings to swim in, the less cumbersome outfits, do their training, finish, go back to the rocks, get their stockings, swim back to shore, and now they were presentable for anyone, on land. So just one amusing example of what they had to go through. And here, I also just want to note that, we still have to keep in mind that women's athletics were popular at this time. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were significantly popular. By 1920, 22% of colleges and universities offered women's athletic programs, and secondary school PE was compulsory in nearly every state. And also a growing number of club teams and company-sponsored teams widened the opportunities for women in sports. And here I also want to acknowledge something I learned about in preparing this presentation, which is the Women's Olympics, that there were alternative Olympics to increase opportunities for female athletes in the 1920s and 30s. So these were obviously sparked by the marginalization that women athletes encountered from the IOC. And so in the early 20s, dissident athletes teamed up with sympathetic supporters to create their own games. And it's this vital yet largely forgotten act of political dissent. So Alice Milliat, a French athlete and activist, was really the brains behind this. After women were excluded from track and field events in the 1920 games, she founded the Fédération Sportive Féminine Internationale, a French name, I apologize for pronunciation, FSFI, founded in 1921. And they, established these games, and they staged them every 4 years through 1934, with participants coming from North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Now at these games, women competed in physically strenuous events like the 1,000 meter race and the shot put. They were not limited to what was deemed safe by others. They competed in events they wanted to. So the first Women's Olympic, it took place in 1922, largely a success. More than 20,000 people attended a single day of the competition in Paris. Athletes from 5 countries participated in 11 events, which was more than twice as many as the IOC would include. 4 years later, they went to Sweden, and then in 1930 in Prague, where it became a 3-day gathering featuring more than 200 elite athletes from 17 countries. And the last games were held in 1934 in London, with 19 countries participating. So the FSFI, enjoyed the success, but ran up against the male sports establishment. But they were instrumental in striking a deal in 1926 that led to track and field being included in 1928. So they did have an impact. And you can learn more about the Women's Olympics in a book in the external resources list will provide, called Power Games, A Political History of the Olympics by Jules Boykoff. So clearing hurdles. Here, women's participation in organized sports then declined from the 1920s to the 1960s as colleges eliminated programs and intercollegiate competition. By 1970, fewer than 30,000 women played collegiate sports in the US. Now, this dearth of women's collegiate athletic opportunities narrowed the US Olympic team's pool of potential athletes, even as the IOC was steadily increasing the number of women's sports over those decades. Club teams continued to be popular, but many sports lacked the funding to support and produce world-class athletes. Okay, and so this is the story for predominantly elite white universities, but the story is different when looking at historically Black colleges during this time. They were more likely to retain their athletic programs for women. And the most prolific program was that at Tennessee State University, where Ed Temple served as the head women's track coach from 1950 to 1994. And during his time, an impressive 40 members of his famed Tiger Bell teams represented Tennessee State in Olympic competition. And they won a total of 23 medals. And here we see Olympian Wilma Rudolph, who Temple coached to her 3 gold medals at the 1960 Rome Olympics. Move forward here to Title IX. So Congress enacted Title IX of the Education Amendments in 1972, which prohibited sex discrimination in any educational program or activity receiving any type of federal financial aid. This summer, Title IX will be celebrating its 50th anniversary, so a very important milestone for a very important law. So Title IX alone did not immediately create access to sports for girls. Many had to fight to ensure its implementation. I think it's just interesting to note here, 1972, also a year for the Winter Olympics, wherein every gold medal that Team USA won at those Olympics was won by a female athlete. So women were still accomplishing a great deal even before Title IX started playing a role. So as I mentioned, there were fewer than 30,000 collegiate women athletes by 1970, but over the next 4 decades, that number increased to 190,000. Now, over the years, Title IX has been inconsistently enforced and many schools have been out of compliance with it, but it has still had the significant impact in increasing opportunity for girls and women in athletics. And thus that has led to greater opportunities and achievements for women in the Olympics. Now in this slide, we have a feature video, Game Changers, American Women in Sports, a discussion of Title IX with Professor Bonnie Morris, a faculty member at UC Berkeley, also a member of the Museum Scholarly Advisory Council. She's an expert on women's sports history. So I encourage you to watch the video, and I also want to plug that on February 13th, she will be speaking as part of a Sundays at Home event for the museum about women in football, American football, past and present. So please do check that out. Here we see US Representative Patsy Mink, Democrat of Hawaii. She was a principal author of Title IX. The law, in fact, was later renamed after her. She herself was a former high school basketball player who was restricted to half-court play under the girls' rules. This was back when, because of fears of undue physical strain, basketball had different rules for men and or boys and girls. And this stayed with her, and Mink made fighting gender discrimination a hallmark of her congressional career. So I want to note here, we see here's a woman who's risen to power in government and is helping to enact legislation to increase opportunities for women in sports. The same can also be said of women advancing in the sciences at this time. As more and more women became researchers and medical professionals, the science began catching up with the expanding field of female athletes. These female medical experts, their research suggested that not only were women not the delicate waifs that popular culture would suggest, but that there were fewer physiologic barriers between men and women than previously thought. So this also, helped expand opportunities for women. So a little more on Title IX, colleges and high schools gradually reintroduced women's varsity sports following passage of the law. And these expanded slots on high school teams, along with the possibility of college scholarships, encouraged the growth of girls' sports programs for younger children at the elementary and middle school levels. And here in this chart, I know it's a little small to see, high school girls' sports participation increased 10 times and collegiate women 6-fold. And not only has the number of high school girl athletes gone up, but number is also increased for boys in high school. But a gap does still remain between boys and girls in terms of participation. Now here, Women of Summer. So in 1991, the IOC implemented a requirement that new Olympic sports include women's events, and this exponentially increased the number of female Olympians. And I want to know what was going on with the IOC and kind of women in leadership positions rather than just on the field by this time. So in 1996, at the Centennial Olympic Games, the IOC held its first ever World Conference on Women in Sport. So prior to this date, there really hadn't been formal discussion about including women more in any sense except on the field. And there had been some female members of the IOC as early as 1981, but it was really this conference that brought it to broader attention. So these conferences on women in sport were held every 4 years in conjunction with the Summer Games. And it was at the 2012 conference that they issued a statement that they recognized that women were, quote, in many instances being provided more equitable opportunities on the playing field, but this was still not translating to a greater number of women in leadership positions in sport. So it's an issue that's been brought to attention, that's been discussed. Various parties are trying to make progress. Sadly, however, since 2012, there have been no further IOC conferences on women in sport, and there are no immediate plans for any more. So bringing this up to 2018, I want to note that there were 3 Olympic sports at the last Winter Olympics that were not open to both men and women. I'm sorry, both Winter and Summer Olympics. Nordic combined was only for men, rhythmic gymnastics and synchronized swimming were only for women. This year at the Winter Olympics, Nordic combined will be open to men, but there's no plans to open up rhythmic gymnastics or synchronized swimming to men. And frankly, I think we should acknowledge that this could carry some sexist implications as well, both by limiting anybody's opportunity on the basis of gender and by perhaps coding these sports as somehow less worthy. So this issue, while less significant today, does persist. So that concludes the exhibit, but I do encourage you to take a further look since there's so much great material. I will now briefly turn to the article, Getting into the Games, Olympic Women. Now this provides a lot of detail, I think, that adds context to the exhibit. I'm just going to mention a few details and bring in some other outside information. So it starts by mentioning Coubertin, pictured here, how he envisioned the Olympics as a festival celebrating men's sporting achievements. The popular culture promoted sports as an outlet for men's aggression, and that it also encouraged moral fortitude. And women were not supposed to be aggressive or competitive at this time. So it's why the original leaders envisioned women as only participating as spectators. It also gives some detail on, I'll leave it there, on women physical education teachers. There's some really interesting material on their attitudes toward limiting competition for women. These educators in the early to mid 20th century wanted to focus on mass participation without competition to reap health benefits from the exercise and physical activity. And they thought competition would deter women from getting involved in athletics. So the story isn't a simple one of men always refusing women entry into the sport. In this way, women played a role in constraining those opportunities. It also, let's see, down here, shows some more information about the role of the Cold War and how gender norms ran up against foreign policy goals. So as governing bodies in the US grew increasingly concerned throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s about the US women's weak showing against Eastern Bloc countries. The Olympics had become a Cold War battlefield, and the East was winning. And so the Eastern Bloc countries were doping athletes to improve conditioning, but they also simply provided more organization and support for training programs. And the US women lacked in comparison, and so they were outmatched in many events. Lastly, to bring it up to some contemporary context, at the 2018 Winter Games, the roster included 131 women among 284 members, and that was the most at the time the women had ever sent to the Winter Games, the American women ever sent to the Winter Games. And this year for the 2022 Winter Games, Team USA will include 115 men to 107 women. So not as many women, but greater gender parity. Okay, I'm just going to stop on the resource page for a moment to bring in a few other outside pieces of information. So here I wanted to mention the Paralympic Games. Now these games grew out of a desire to provide war veterans with physical impairments opportunities for athletic participation. So it also has this very male-centered origins. The Paralympic Games were initially held in Rome in 1960, and American women did not participate, but 45 women did participate in those games. And beginning in the next Paralympic Games, which took place in 1964 in Tokyo, American women have participated in them all. And I encourage you to check out our biography of Marla Runyon, a Paralympian and an Olympian in track and field and cycling. She competed between 1992 and 2004. And we will also soon have a biography of Candace Cable, who's a skier and wheelchair racer and the first American woman to win medals in both the summer and winter Paralympic Games. In this past summer in Tokyo, the US Paralympic team won 104 total medals, and women were responsible for about 62% of those medals. So they had a very good showing. And this year, the Paralympics will take place from March 4th to the 13th. And I bring this up to say that women have been and continue to be an instrumental part of the Paralympic story. I also want to share some information from Outsports about the participation of publicly out LGBTQ athletes. At least 186 publicly out gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and non-binary athletes were in Tokyo for the Summer Olympic Games. Now that's about triple the number that were at the 2016 Games in Rio. And it's also greater than the number of athletes who have participated in all of the previous Olympic Games, summer and winter, combined while publicly out. And the US has had the most out athletes of any country with 36. Also, women on the list outnumber men by about a 9-to-1 margin, with women's soccer having more than 40 out players. So we're seeing a lot of strength in numbers there of more and more publicly out athletes. I'm briefly going to mention another set of Olympics like the Women's Olympics. There were the Gay Games created by Tom Waddell in 1982. He had been a decathlete at the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games, had come out in 1976 publicly, and he was inspired by the protest of Tommy Smith and John Carlos in Mexico City in 1968, where they raised their fists. It was in protest against racism. after their medal win in the 200-meter sprint. And so he designed this event to give his, peer LGBTQ athletes the positive feeling of the opening ceremonies that he felt, and also in hopes of humanizing LGBTQ athletes for the rest of the country. At the first games in 1982, more than 1,300 athletes participated. And the games continue to this day. They will take place in Hong Kong in 2023, postponed from the pandemic. They draw over 10,000 athletes now. So another example of, in this case, it's men and women participating in their own way in athletic competition at an Olympic level. Lastly, I want to turn to the infographic we have here. It's got these wonderful charts of, numbers of US summer athletes, men and women. You can see it right, graphically laid out there. This wonderful graphic of summer and winter Olympic medalists. It gives names, sports, the number of medals they won by year. Also looking at both summer and winter athletes here and their numbers. And then a great timeline here, more of a marathon than a sprint, showing when different sports were added for women throughout Olympic history. And I think a very interesting thing to do here is to look at a sport and then look up, when was it added for men? What is the history of it on the other side? So for example, soccer or football was added in 1996 for women. And when you look into it, it had actually been present since 1900 for men. So that just really lays some of the disparities bare for you. And lastly, it includes these highlights of early Olympians, some of whom we've mentioned, and some of whom I haven't been able to get to, just laying out their early milestones. So, and then lastly, I want to mention some issues of protest, because this is a really big theme for women Olympians, for Olympians in total. And there are these important protests related to issues of racial and gender justice. So going back to Tokyo in 2021, we had women's soccer teams who were kneeling before games in a gesture to end racism. From the US, Chile, Great Britain, New Zealand. We had the German gymnastics team participating in full-length unitards because they felt they would be more comfortable and improve their performance rather than the ones that bared their legs. And similarly, the Norwegian beach handball team refused to wear bikini bottoms. And this was actually slightly before the Olympics. They got headlined when they were fined for these uniform violations, but they did end up changing the rules. In terms of the 2022 Winter Olympics, there's obviously some issues of protest going on around these upcoming games. In particular, there is the situation with three-time tennis Olympian Peng Shuai, who recently accused a Chinese government official of sexual assault. The Chinese authorities attempted to scrub it from the internet, cover it up, and downplay it. And then there was outcry from the international community with concern over her fate, calls for a boycott. The IOC simply called for quiet diplomacy to address the issue, which drew further criticism. And it's, again, women's sports. We have the Women's Tennis Association, which is the only major organization to boycott not exactly the games, but their events and programming in China as a result. So they're taking an economic hit for their stance on human rights. And of course, there's the diplomatic boycott of the games. The United States, along with Britain, Canada, and Australia, will not send government officials or diplomats to the games. All their athletes will take part, though. The US government has cited genocide and crimes against humanity concerning the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, a northwestern region of China, and along with Chinese repression in Tibet and Hong Kong. So there's a lot of criticism going on about these games. The IOC maintains that the games are non-political, continues to prohibit athletes protesting, but obviously that still makes its way in there. So these issues are tied into, issues of women in society, women's rights, women in athletics. And lastly, looking forward, we're definitely going to be seeing more pioneering feats by trans and non-binary athletes. This past November, the IOC announced a new policy about trans and non-binary participation. It's going to be more individual sport, letting them come up with their own guidelines that are intended to draw from evidence-based research, and that would emphasize fairness, harm prevention, and competitive advantage rather than simply hormone levels as they have been. So that won't come into effect until after these Winter Games, but that's a big change on the horizon. And now to close, running a little over, I just want to mention lastly some other National Women's History Museum resources. We have biographies of Olympians Margaret Ives Abbott, Wilma Rudolph, Babe Didrikson Zaharias, Marla Runyon, Billie Jean King, who she coached tennis teams in '96 and 2000. And forthcoming in February, we will have biographies of Ibtihaj Muhammad, a fencer, who was the first woman to wear a hijab while representing the US in the Olympics, Serena Williams, four-time gold medalist in tennis, Lisa Leslie, four-time gold medalist in basketball, and Alice Coachman. Further, we have another exhibit called Game Changers, Women in Sports, and I will be doing a walkthrough of that exhibit on February 20th, so I hope you join us for that. And then I simply encourage you to check out the list of external resources we're providing, and thank you very much.
Mari, thank you for your time and for being with us today. Thank you, everyone, and we'll sign off. Thanks.
Thank you.